The Glassmaker is about a family who make glass on the island of Murano, which is just off of Venice. And the book spans 500 years. So it starts in 1486, it ends in 2022, but it follows the same family. And I do something a little unusual, which is I cover 500 years of Venetian history, but 60 something years of a family's history. They age not at the same rate as Venice. So they skip over time a little bit. And that allows me to, as someone put it, bring history with a capital H into small history of the family, and allows us to sort of get a sense of how Venice changed over time over those hundreds of years and how the family changed too. I absolutely went to Venice. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, so I had an excuse to go to Venice as many times as possible. I've been a lot even before this book, but it's one of my favorite places in the world, and it was a joy to research its history so that I got to know it in a deeper way than just as a visitor. And I also spent a lot of time on Murano, the little island off of Venice, where they moved all the glassmakers in the 13th century because they wanted to stop fires from spreading in Venice. And they said, well, if we put it on this little island, if it burns a little island, that's okay. You just don't want it to burn the big island. So I spent a lot of time there, and I got to know glassmakers, watched them. I tried making glass beads myself, and I also blew glass for an afternoon, which was really scary. But I always like to do what my characters do so that I get a sense of how to write about it, and I get little details that I can add into the book that I wouldn't otherwise figure out. The thing I took from it was that it started out and remains a very male profession, but women are allowed to do one thing, or were, and that was to make glass beads at their kitchen table at night, away from the big furnace. So it wasn't in competition with the men. It was almost like doing little work that would supplement the family income. And so that's how I approach it, is a woman who wants to do this and is not allowed to work in the workshop. So she makes glass beads to help her family. And over the centuries, things change ever so slightly for women. They become, they get more agency, they get more socioeconomic power. And by the 21st century, she has her own business and she's much more accepted. But the book is really about whether her family, particularly her brother, who's a glass maestro, is ever going to accept her skill and ability, and it takes that long. But now on Murano, there are women in the furnace working with the furnaces. Still not as many as men. It's still mainly men, but there are more women. It's more accepted, and it was a lot of fun, sort of plotting my way through the centuries and figuring out when would they get a little bit more power. I did decide early on that I was not going to have the family and the people in Murano and Venice age at the same rate as the rest of the world. So there's this difference between Venice time and time on what they called terra firma, the rest of the world. But I thought, oh, I'm going to cover 500 years of Venice history. And I think if I had to do it all over again, I probably wouldn't have done that because it's very daunting. So I started. I mean, I suppose my tips are, what I did was I studied Venetian history. I read about it, talked about it, looked at a lot of stuff, paintings, and went around it. And I tried to pick out what I thought were the most important moments in Venetian history, which are not necessarily the obvious ones. That's the thing, is sometimes it's something that jumps out at me, and this is the case of all of my books, is I'm looking for the gap in the history, in the story that hasn't been told, and that's the gap that I can fill. But then there are other times, for this book, there were some obvious moments. So Napoleon conquered Venice in 1797, and I thought I've got to include that. But I thought, well, maybe it won't be about him specifically conquering it. He's already conquered it, but he sends his wife Josephine to check out Venice, see what they're going to do with it. And I thought that's what's more interesting to me. And my main character, Ursula Rosso, she's a bead maker, and I thought maybe she could make a necklace for Josephine. Because Josephine, they're all the paintings, she's wearing necklaces. And I thought, how can I bring those two things together? So it's like looking at something that is an important moment, but trying to see it sideways, see if there's a different way in. And this was particularly important for Venice because there are literally thousands of books about Venice, and I had to figure out a different angle from which to approach it. I enjoyed having her create her own business and moving. The big moment is when she rents a shop in Venice rather than on Murano, because a lot of glass is sold on Murano, but then some of the glass makers have little shops. And it was a lot of fun describing that process and also what it's like to be a shopkeeper in Venice now and how difficult it is because it is sort of overrun with tourists. And how does that wear you down day after day? I talked to various shopkeepers who are saying, "Oh, this is just so crazy." And one I stole from her story completely nakedly. She said, I have a bead shop, and across the street from me across the passage opened this tourist shop, and they were selling glass things that are made in China, not in Murano, and they were much cheaper than my stuff, which is better, but it's more expensive. And she said it broke my heart to see all the tourists walk by, look in my window, then go in the other shop and buy some cheap little trinket. And and I just copied that almost word for word. So there are a lot of difficulties about being a glass person in Venice.